Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.44, Ticonderoga. Welcome back. Last time, we spent our episode talking about the plans for both the British and the Americans heading into 1777. The plan for the Americans was simple enough. Keep the army in the field and take shots at the British army wherever they could, while avoiding major engagements. For General Howe, his plan was literally the opposite, as he desperately sought a major engagement where he could deliver that fatal blow that would knock the Americans out of the war entirely. Well, Howe had his eyes set south on Philadelphia, a second and seemingly uncoordinated theater of the war under John Burgoyne, sought to move from Canada and cut off New England. This week, we are going to use our time to look at two primary things. First, it has been a while since we have talked about American diplomatic attempts, so we are going to go ahead and rectify that. Then we will head to Canada and get our first peeks at Burgoyne's army, as they begin what they all assume to be their triumphant march to the south. Before we join up with John Burgoyne, I want to first talk about the American attempts at establishing diplomacy. Part of the justification behind the Declaration of Independence had been opening up the ability of the Americans to try and secure alliances with foreign powers, and, to be more specific, France. Within a few months of the Declaration, in September, Congress sent its first official delegation across the Atlantic to attempt to secure French support for the American war. The French made natural, if not somewhat uncomfortable, allies for the Americans. Following their loss in the 7 Years' War, the French had been looking for anything to help re-establish their reputation. The loss had been humiliating in scope, and they were ready to avenge it. French Foreign Minister, the Comte de Vergennes, was eager to find some way to rebuild an empire that had largely been stripped away a little more than a decade earlier. Even before official channels between the Americans and the French were opened, back channels had existed since 1775. Arthur Lee and Celestine were in communication with the French in an attempt to secure military and financial assistance. These American envoys were quietly welcomed in France by a country that had its interest piqued by the events in America, but who were not yet ready to take that jump into full conflict with the British. Although the French were not looking for a full-scale war in 1775, King Louis XVI was interested in making the British suffer. The man who pulled all of this together was Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais. Beaumarchais, a popular playwright in his day, became interested in the American struggle, and soon was blowing up both Vergennes and often the king directly. Thankfully, both men were interested in sticking it to the British, and agreed to begin supplying the American colonies. Now, critically for the French, while they wanted to help the Americans, they were not looking to be drawn into a war, at least not yet. The solution, therefore, was that Beaumarchais would establish a shell corporation to secretly sell supplies to the Americans, under the guise of a business contract. The deal itself had the French sending weapons and supplies to the Americans, under a vague and generous line of credit, which was to be repaid in the future with tobacco. Although on paper the French did have some terms of repayment, it should be made clear here that there seems to not have been any actual expectation of repayment from the government. These supplies, therefore, were really more along the lines of gifts, with some plausible deniability baked in for the French. These weapons, now clandestinely being shipped to America, were coming directly from the French arsenals. The French further allowed American privateers to retrofit their ships in French ports. This is something that was going to need to happen with a great deal of delicacy, as it certainly could lead to war should the British become aware of the action. Plus, it lacked that plausible deniability that the plan through Beaumarchais had. The French government issued public declarations to the effect that they were remaining neutral. However, these declarations aside, Americans were now using French ports to retrofit their ships and harass British shipping lanes. It does need to be said here that the British were not stupid. It is easy to sit around and ask ourselves how they were so oblivious to the actions of the French. The answer is that they were never oblivious to the actions of the French. Lee, for example, employed multiple British spies. Likewise, the British agents in France complained often and loudly at the fact that neutral France was allowing their ports to be used to the detriment of Great Britain by the Americans. When they were not being flat out ignored, Vergennes only took enough action to keep up appearances. He would seize the American ship in question in order to appease the British, before secretly reimbursing the American captains and, accidentally, allowing the ships to escape. The British knew that the French were helping the Americans. However, the real question here is, what were they going to do about it? Sure, had the British wanted justification for a war with France, they had it. But that is just the thing. The British did not really want a war with France. This entire thing, the entire American uprising, was in large part related to the costs of the last war with France. At least as of this point, French actions had not yet extended to a place where the British were forced to declare a war and turn their headache in America into a global conflict. While the use of a shell company to funnel weapons and supplies certainly did help the Americans early during the war, it was alone never going to be enough. Even prior to the declaration, many in Congress recognized that assistance was going to be required. The Declaration was arguably written for a foreign audience to justify the decisions of the Americans and, hopefully, open the door for future alliances. An American delegation had set sail in September to France, with the stated goal of entering into a more formal alliance. To accomplish this, the young United States sent over Benjamin Franklin to join Lee and Silas Deane. Franklin was easily the most well-known American of the time, and the closest thing that the United States had to an actual diplomat. Recall that Franklin had spent nearly the entire imperial crisis back in London, trying, ultimately unsuccessfully, to smooth things over. Even before he had gone to London, however, he was well known throughout all of Europe for his scientific experiments, specifically those around electricity. Upon his arrival in France in December 1776, he was an instant celebrity among the Parisian population. While in Paris, Franklin quickly became something of an object of interest. In addition to attending parties and dining with influential members of Parisian society, Franklin also drew a lot of attention from men looking to offer their services to the Americans. Since the end of the 7 Years' War, more than a decade earlier, there had been little opportunity for men seeking advancement through military service. Now, Franklin suddenly found himself inundated with men seeking commissions in the American Army for that chance to prove themselves. This would become a major source of annoyance both for Franklin and George Washington. Franklin was exhausted from the constant callers seeking a commission, while Washington struggled with the question of what he should do with those that Franklin did provide letters of introduction for. Now, most of the guys who came to Franklin could be written off easily enough, and really, they needed to be written off. Washington made clear that while the enthusiasm was great and all, the Army was fully staffed already, and that future openings needed to exist for the purpose of promotion. The last thing that the Army needed was a bunch of foreign adventure seekers. Yet, while the onslaught of people seeking letters of introduction was exhausting for Franklin, there were a handful of people who he met during this period that are worthy of mention. Franklin would give a letter of recommendation to Casimir Pulaski from Poland, who would essentially create the American cavalry. There was the Prussian, Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, who from now on we are going to refer to as Baron von Steuben, who, despite some exaggeration of his credentials, he claimed to be a lieutenant general, but in reality he was a mere captain, would introduce meaningful discipline into the American army. Finally, Franklin would recommend Gilbert du Motier, Marquis de Lafayette. Franklin would write back to Congress, letting them know about the young Lafayette, letting them know to play nicely, as he was much loved in France, and critically, he was well connected at court. Silas Deane would write to Robert Morris more directly, letting him know that Lafayette was also exceedingly rich, as a result of his marriage into the powerful and wealthy Noailles family. In other words, don't do something to insult the rich, well-connected French guy when we are trying to put together an alliance with the French. Although Franklin was able to recommend a handful of men who would indeed become very important in the war, his purpose was not to find people to fight. Rather, it was to create an alliance. Although the French were willing to help the Americans, Versailles remained reluctant to get involved in the greater conflict. The French had shown at least some interest in joining the American cause during 1776, following the evacuation of Boston and the Declaration of Independence. However, the American defeats that summer and fall had poured some cold water on the prospects of an actual alliance. Really, though, for the French, the biggest problem with joining the Americans was the Spanish. Recall back during episode 3.41, when we discussed the alliance that existed between the French and the Spanish. If you need a reminder, both the French and the Spanish had entered into something called the Family Pact, which was named that because both countries had a Bourbon monarch. In 1777, France, in order to maintain their alliance with Spain, would have needed Spanish approval to get involved in a war. It was not necessarily that Spain wasn't interested in sticking it to the British. In fact, the Spanish were not all that opposed to a war at this time. Having long been reduced to the status of a second-rate empire, the Spanish were eager to right some of these humiliations that they had faced throughout the course of the 18th century at the hands of Great Britain. The Spanish saw the loss of Gibraltar and Minorca, back during the War of Spanish Succession, as a national humiliation, and were very interested in their reconquest. Not to mention that Spain was increasingly interested in potentially trying to conquer Portugal and unite the Iberian Peninsula. The problem for the Spanish is that, while they had no problem taking shots at the British and even potentially fighting a war with them, they did have a problem with recognizing the independence of the United States. What we must consider is what such a recognition would mean for the Spanish. Although Spain had largely become a secondary player in European affairs, no longer the major power that it had been back during the 16th century, they still had colonial ambitions in the Americas, including territories to the west of the Mississippi that an independent United States might be eager to gobble up. More than fear over the prospect of an independent American nation with expansionist dreams, the current situation for the Spanish was likewise no more appealing. In the event that the Spanish went ahead and openly acknowledged American independence and joined in a war against the British, that would send a problematic message to all those people living in Spanish colonies. What would happen to the Spanish Empire if concepts like republicanism started seeping into those colonies? Sure, the Spanish were eager to take their shots at the British. However, the risk of doing so could dangerously expose their own empire. Even in the situation where Charles III of Spain contributed financially to the American effort, it was more out of hopes that both the United States and Britain would hemorrhage money during a war that did nothing but weaken both parties. The situation heading into the campaigns of 1777 was thus. The French were intrigued by the idea of aiding the Americans. Not really for the reason of encouraging enlightened republicanism, though Parisian high society sure liked to dream, but rather because it was in the best interest of the French. France was desperate to restore some of that power and luster that had been lost during the 7 Years' War, and the American Revolution provided them with just such an opportunity. The French, however, had their concerns, and as a result of these concerns, would remain hesitant to fully commit themselves to the effort. There was a real fear amongst the French leadership that the Americans and the British would settle their differences and reunite, a situation that could risk exposing the French and leaving them isolated should they join the war too soon. Likewise, the closest ally to the French, the Spanish, were happy to take their shots at Britain, yet remained hesitant to get involved in a war that could put dangerous ideas into the heads of their own colonists and potentially threaten their own colonial empire. What the French needed to take that next step and agree to an actual alliance with the Americans was confidence. They needed something to clear up those misgivings about joining this war effort. They needed to know that they were not going to ally with the Americans, only for the United States to buckle under and reunite with the British Empire that would now leave France exposed and potentially alone. We are going to leave the French and the American delegation to negotiate for now, and head back across the Atlantic to Canada, where General Burgoyne was getting ready to set out for what was sure to be an easy trip down south to Albany. To fully understand the events that we are about to see, we need to know just a bit more about John Burgoyne himself. Born in 1722 and a veteran of the 7 Years' War, Burgoyne had established himself as a popular leader amongst his men. Burgoyne, as we are going to see, is a guy who just completely oozed confidence, and did so in such a way that it was infectious to those around him. If he was sure of victory heading into the campaign of 1777, so were his men. As historian Robert Middlecuff would write, within mere days of leaving Montreal to begin his march to the south in May of 1777, Burgoyne's confidence was quickly transforming into delusions of grandeur. On June 20th, Burgoyne would issue a proclamation encouraging the Americans to lay down their arms and embrace their British overlords, explaining that, if they should not peacefully greet the British, the result would be hellfire. He waxed poetically about restoring the English Constitution, and paid lip service to all of those things that one would expect. The problem with this, however, is not that Burgoyne seemed to be under the belief that he was leading a liberating army to save the Americans. Pretty much everybody was able to recognize that for what it was: overly dramatic rhetoric. The real problem is that in this proclamation he stated, "I have but to give stretch to the Indian forces under my direction, and they amount to thousands, to overtake the hardened enemies of Great Britain and America." Burgoyne goes on to say, "The messengers of justice and wrath await them in the field, and devastation, famine, and every concomitant horror that a reluctant but indispensable prosecution of military duty must occasion will bar the way to their return." Today, we are on the 153rd episode of this podcast. And if you have taken this journey with me, you should all be well aware of the fact that there are two things that could cause terror for the Americans. The first was the risk of slave rebellion. The second was the risk of Indian uprisings. We have spent a whole lot of time throughout the course of this show talking about the various Indian wars and the very real psychological effect that it had upon the colonists. It likewise was not something that people did not have recent experience with. Part of the crisis that got the Americans to this point can be directed back towards Pontiac's rebellion, a decade and a half earlier. Now, here is John Burgoyne, tapping into the deepest of all American fears and threatening to exploit it. Burgoyne's comment about unleashing Indian aggressions had done a lot to give the Americans a victory in the PR department. Even those in the United States who remained loyal were turned off by the dangerous words being issued from Burgoyne. This was not a fact missed in London either, as Parliament shook their collective head at these comments. The colonial press, which had already grown fond of attacking Burgoyne for his often bombastic statements, seized on the opportunity. Papers quickly published Burgoyne's statements and used it to help illustrate the level of barbarity that the British were willing to stoop to. PR disasters aside, when Burgoyne set out on June 20th for Crown Point, he did have good reason to be confident. He was moving south with a large army, apparently a good number of Indian allies, and an ample supply of confidence. After a short stop at Crown Point, Burgoyne's forces made their way towards the main target at Ticonderoga. For the American forces, there was a lot of chaos and disarray heading into the summer of 1777. There remained a lot of questions when it came to who was actually in overall command. Since the previous summer, it had been somewhat unclear if it was Philip Schuyler or Horatio Gates. This was a real problem for the Americans for a couple of reasons. First, there is the obvious problem that comes from a lack of clear command structure. As a large British army was moving towards an important and valuable target at Ticonderoga, the two highest-ranking commanders were trying to figure out who was actually calling the shots. The battle that ensued internally between Schuyler and Gates was itself brutal, with Gates not holding back with how he felt about Schuyler. One of the things that is important to recognize about Gates is that he had a way of just rubbing people the wrong way. When he arrived in Philadelphia to plead his case, he spent his entire time on an angry tirade against not just Schuyler, but also the delegates that he viewed as being opposed to his position. This did little to ingratiate Gates with just about anybody, and he was more or less swept out of Congress without being invited back. This means that at this critical moment when the Americans needed to be figuring out how to defend Ticonderoga, nobody seemed terribly interested in taking command over the fort. Sure, Burgoyne was making statements that enraged just about everybody, but the Americans at this point were just aimlessly drifting in the north. Despite the confusion, the meaningful command of Ticonderoga was in the hands of Arthur Sinclair, who was in command of some 3,000 troops. Burgoyne was able to recognize the dangers for the Americans, and was not looking simply to chase them out of the fort. What he saw was a perfect opportunity to strike and cut off the ability of the Americans to escape. Should Burgoyne be able to capture all of those men at Ticonderoga, it would significantly weaken the ability of the Americans to resist his push to the south. Burgoyne's plan to trap the Americans saw him attacking from both sides of the fort, with the Germans taking the east and the British regulars attacking from the west. Conveniently for Burgoyne, a large hill, known as either Sugarloaf Hill or Mount Defiance, depending on who you're talking to, dominated the local landscape around Ticonderoga. Mount Defiance, if you will recall, got its nickname years earlier, back during the French and Indian War, when the British had recognized that from a position on the hill it would be possible to fire directly into the middle of Fort Carillon. This is the location where Montcalm would manage his defense of Carillon, despite being wildly outnumbered. It is also worth a passing note that it is the same battle where George Howe was killed. We talked about all of this back in episode 3.33. So, we here at The Political History of the United States have known for the last 56 or so episodes that Mount Defiance was a critical location, seeing as how control over that hill would dangerously expose the fort hundreds of feet below. Of course, this means that the Americans spent their time and efforts fortifying it. Right? Well, unfortunately for the Americans, they did not fortify the hill. It was not as though they failed to recognize the importance of Mount Defiance. It was the highest peak in the area, so you could not exactly miss it. In fact, for a full year before the actual battle, work was being done at Ticonderoga under the command of Horatio Gates. Gates had assigned Jonathan Baldwin to the task of building the fortifications. The problem is that Baldwin ignored Mount Defiance. What Baldwin figured is that the heavily wooded hill, standing some 850 feet above the surrounding area, was going to be too difficult to drag artillery up. Not everybody agreed with Baldwin here, and in fact there were those who did believe that he was making a critical error in judgment. Colonel John Trumbull, who would in due time become one of the most celebrated American artists of his age, happened to be present at Ticonderoga during the fall of 1776, and did everything he could to sound the warning alarms. Although he did manage to convince American leadership as to the problem, there was not the manpower to do much of anything about it. This means that, despite the warnings, nobody ever paid any real attention to Mount Defiance. Rather, it was the smaller and seemingly easier hills around Ticonderoga that got all the attention when it came to building up the fortifications. Although the Americans had done all they could to prepare for the British, their decision not to reinforce Mount Defiance would render it all moot. It took Burgoyne literally no time at all to recognize the importance of the location. Quickly, the British were able to prove to the Americans below that it was indeed very much possible to drag artillery up those steep slopes. By July 5th, the situation was all but settled. Burgoyne had managed to set up a battery on top of Mount Defiance. Although the Americans did make a few attempts to dislodge the British with an artillery barrage of their own, the American guns were unable to hit the British position. Really, the only positive for the Americans is that they were quick to realize that Ticonderoga was untenable, and that they were going to lose the fort. At a council of war on the 5th, the gathered quickly agreed with Sinclair, and decided that they needed to abandon the fort as quickly as possible. The Americans were outnumbered, in a bad position, and knew that any battle was likely to end poorly. As such, there appears to be no evidence that anybody really fought against the grain and argued for trying to defend Ticonderoga. The evacuation began the next morning, and was not exactly well executed. Unlike the evacuations that we have seen under Washington, where the British wake up to an enemy that is simply gone, the British became aware that the Americans were withdrawing right away. Burgoyne, seeing his enemy on the ropes, immediately ordered an advance, which in a few hours' time managed to catch up with the American rear. The American rear guard was made up of right around 1,000 men, under the command of Colonel Seth Warner. The ensuing battle was a confusing mess, with both sides fighting in challenging conditions. Although they made a valiant effort, at the end of the day the British were just too much, and after a couple hours of fighting, in which at times it looked like Warner was going to withstand the British onslaught, his men turned and took to fleeing from the British. The main body of the American column managed to stay just ahead of the approaching British, who broke off their pursuit when the Americans reached the relative safety of Fort Edward. The plan for Burgoyne at this point called for him to fall back to Ticonderoga. Now, this was not a new plan that was being formed in the moment. As it turned out, Burgoyne had actually made these plans back in London. The plan was to board boats and move into Lake George, travel south to Fort George, and then from there move the 10 or so miles out towards the Hudson. Everything was off to a good start, and this seemed entirely possible. Which makes the decision of Burgoyne to basically ditch these plans on the fly surprising. What Burgoyne would explain after the fact is that he was worried about pulling back to Ticonderoga. His army had all that momentum, and he feared that having them fall back to Ticonderoga would be a blow to morale. Furthermore, the last thing that he wanted to do was allow the Americans a chance to catch their breath and have time to dig in. What Burgoyne wanted was to keep pushing and hopefully overrun the Americans. The loss of Ticonderoga holds something of an interesting position in American history. On its face, there was nothing good that came from it. The Americans had lost a critical position, largely due to an inept defense. The American leadership knew that Mount Defiance was a threat. John Trumbull made sure of that. And yet, really, they just would shrug their shoulders and ignore the very obvious danger. Yet, the loss of Ticonderoga really is an often ignored moment in the Revolution. This is likely because we know, and my apologies for the spoilers here, how Burgoyne's march is going to turn out. In a few months' time, the loss of Ticonderoga is going to be rendered meaningless. However, following the evacuation of the fort, there was a lot of shock and feelings of being dejected proliferating amongst the public. As historian Robert Parkinson writes, throughout the colonies, news of the fort's loss spread, though oftentimes official channels, such as newspapers, resisted printing the news in fear of hurting the cause. Despite the fact that the news was not exactly on blast, there are letters from people written contemporaneously with the fall of the fort, discussing their shock at what had happened. As Parkinson writes, one of the biggest problems with the hesitance of the papers to report the events of what took place at Ticonderoga is that it provided a good amount of fuel for the rumor mill, with various reports really moving in all possible directions. The public was upset and had a whole lot of questions of exactly what had happened and how this could have happened. How had the Americans lost Ticonderoga, and indeed lost it without a fight? As per what is probably expected, the senior Army leadership, men like Philip Schuyler, blamed inexperienced troops, lambasting men in his ranks as being too old, too young, and complaining about black troops fighting in the army. Although some, specifically Sam Adams, would call this out as being nothing more than excuses, the army stuck with their now standard line. The loss at Ticonderoga would have another, somewhat surprising effect as well. At the same time that the fort was falling into British hands, the Massachusetts Assembly was considering a bill that would have abolished slavery within the state. The problem, though, is when men like Schuyler go out and blame black troops for the loss of such a symbolic holding, it did little to garner any public support for that plan. Understanding that Burgoyne's capture of Ticonderoga was inevitably going to push his plan for the isolation of New England that much closer to a reality, leadership both at the local level in Massachusetts, but also at the Continental Congress, recommended pumping the brakes on any bill that would have the effect of freeing slaves in Massachusetts. Although the writing was on the wall that Massachusetts was moving generally in the direction of the eventual emancipation of their slaves, the fall of Ticonderoga provided a well-timed excuse to delay such a vote. While we are on the subject of freeing the slaves, it is worth noting that at the same time that all of this was happening, Vermont was busy declaring its independence from New York. Now, Vermont and New York had been engaged in a tense crisis for a while, which led Vermont to declaring its independence from New York in January 1777. That July, Vermont issued a state constitution, which included giving all adult men the vote, as well as outright abolishing slavery within the state. Not only was it an exceptionally democratic government, but that decision to abolish slavery made it the first constitution anywhere to outright ban the practice. Although Sinclair would personally shoulder a lot of the blame for the loss of the fort, some of it certainly deserved. It should be to his credit that he had managed to get the army out of there largely intact. Sinclair likewise would accept the blame for the loss personally, rather than pointing the finger back to his commanding officer, Schuyler. Schuyler was already hated in New England, so by Sinclair accepting the blame, he denied the New Englanders further ammunition, whereby they could sow further discord amongst the senior army leadership. If anything, Sinclair would go on the offensive, calling out the newspapers for irresponsible reporting and lecturing that there were probably pretty good reasons why the army was being less than forthcoming with the exact details into military affairs. The loss of Ticonderoga was a blow to the Americans. However, it should not simply be ignored that Sinclair did get his army out intact. The retreat may have been messier than would have been ideal, but still, his army survived. It is possible that, had events played out differently, we might look at Ticonderoga as being some kind of a turning point, where things began to fall apart. Had Burgoyne managed to smash the American army at Ticonderoga, thus weakening the ability of the Americans to resist further British advances, maybe Burgoyne succeeds and cuts off New England. Maybe isolating the Northeast would have been sufficient cause to mark the beginning of the end of the American war effort. Of course, the truth is that we don't know what would have happened if the Americans had suffered a more devastating loss at Ticonderoga. We don't know because that is not how things played out. Sure, the fort was lost, but the American army had managed to escape relatively unscathed. They survived to fight another day. What nobody on either side knew in early July 1777 is that in short order, that momentum that Burgoyne was seemingly enjoying would dramatically shift sides. Next time, we are going to spend our time moving between the events in the north with Burgoyne, as he prepares confidently to march his army to their seemingly easy victory. Well, meanwhile in the south, we will join back up with George Washington, who was busy facing the looming threat of a British invasion of the American capital in Philadelphia. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here in 2 weeks' time as the British try to knock the Americans out of the war once and for all.